Julius Robert Oppenheimer was an American theoretical physicist. Oppenheimer was the director of Los Alamos Laboratory during World War II and is often credited as the father of the atomic bomb for his role in the Manhattan Project, the research and development undertaking that created the first nuclear weapons. Oppenheimer attended Harvard University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in 1925. He studied physics at the University of Cambridge and the University of Göttingen, where he received his PhD in 1927. He held academic positions at the University of California, Berkeley, and the California Institute of Technology, and made significant contributions to theoretical physics, including quantum mechanics and nuclear physics. During World War II, he was recruited to work on the Manhattan Project, and in 1943 appointed director of the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. Tasked with developing the weapons, Oppenheimer's leadership and scientific expertise were instrumental in the success of the project. He was among those who observed the Trinity test on July 16, 1945, in which the first atomic bomb was successfully detonated. He later remarked that the explosion brought to his mind the words from the Hindu scripture Bhagavad Gita, "No, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In August 1945, the atomic bombs were used on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only use of nuclear weapons in the war. After the war ended, Oppenheimer became chairman of the influential General Advisory Committee of the newly created United States Atomic Energy Commission. He lobbied for international control of nuclear power to avert nuclear proliferation and nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. He opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb during a 1949 to 1950 governmental debate on the question, and subsequently took stances on defense-related issues that provoked the ire of some U.S. government and military factions. During the Second Red Scare, those stances, together with past associations Oppenheimer had with people and organizations affiliated with the Communist Party, led to the revocation of a security clearance in a much-discussed security hearing in 1954. Effectively stripped of his direct political influence, he continued to lecture, write, and work in physics. 9 years later, President John F. Kennedy awarded him, and Lyndon B. Johnson presented him with, the Enrico Fermi Award as a gesture of political rehabilitation. In 2022, 55 years after his death, the U.S. government nullified its 1954 decision and affirmed Oppenheimer's loyalty. Oppenheimer's achievements in physics include the Born-Oppenheimer approximation for molecular wave functions, work on the theory of electrons and positrons, the Oppenheimer-Phillips process in nuclear fusion, and the first prediction of quantum tunneling. With his students, he also made important contributions to the modern theory of neutron stars and black holes, as well as to quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, and the interactions of cosmic rays. As a teacher and promoter of science, he is remembered as the founding father of the American School of Theoretical Physics that gained world prominence in the 1930s. After World War II, he became director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, New Jersey. Early life. Childhood and education. J. Robert Oppenheimer was born into a non-observant Jewish family in New York City on April 22nd, 1904, to Ella, a painter, and Julius Seligman Oppenheimer, a successful textile importer. Julius was born in Hanau, then part of the Hesse-Nassau province of the Kingdom of Russia, and came to the United States as a teenager in 1888 with few resources, no money, no baccalaureate studies, and no knowledge of the English language. He was hired by a textile company and within a decade was an executive there, eventually becoming wealthy. In 1912, the family moved to an apartment on the 11th floor of 155 Riverside Drive near West 88th Street, Manhattan, an area known for luxurious mansions and townhouses. Their art collection included works by Pablo Picasso and Edouard Vuillard, and at least 3 original paintings by Vincent van Gogh. Robert had a younger brother, Frank, who also became a physicist, and later found the Exploratorium Science Museum in San Francisco. Oppenheimer was initially educated at the Alcuin Preparatory School. In 1911, he entered the Ethical Culture Society School. This had been founded by Felix Adler to promote a form of ethical training based on the ethical culture movement, whose motto was Deep Before Creed. His father had been a member of the society for many years, serving on its board of trustees from 1907 to 1915. Oppenheimer was a versatile scholar, interested in English and French literature, and particularly in mineralogy. He completed the 3rd and 4th grades in 1 year and skipped half of the 8th grade. During his final year, he became interested in chemistry. He graduated in 1921 and entered Harvard College 1 year later at age 18. Because he suffered an attack of colitis while prospecting in Joshtymyr during a family summer vacation in Europe, to help him recover from the illness, his father enlisted the help of his English teacher Herbert Smith, who took him back to New Mexico, where Oppenheimer fell in love with horseback riding in the southwestern United States. Oppenheimer majored in chemistry, but Harvard required science students to also study history, literature, philosophy, or mathematics. He compensated for his late start by taking 6 courses each term and was admitted to the Undergraduate Honor Society Phi Beta Kappa. In his first year, he admitted to graduate standing in physics on the basis of independent study, which he was not meant to require the basic classes and could enroll instead in advanced ones. He was attracted to experimental physics by a course on thermodynamics taught by Percy Bridgman. In 1925, after 3 years of study, Oppenheimer graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree, summa cum laude. Studies in Europe. In 1924, Oppenheimer was informed that he had been accepted into Christ's College, Cambridge. He wrote to Ernest Rutherford requesting permission to work at the Cavendish Laboratory. Bridgman provided Oppenheimer with a recommendation, which conceded that Oppenheimer's clumsiness in the laboratory made it apparent his forte was not experimental, but rather theoretical physics. Rutherford was unimpressed, but Oppenheimer went to Cambridge in the hope of landing another offer. He was ultimately accepted by J.J. Thomson on condition that he complete a basic laboratory course. Oppenheimer was very unhappy at Cambridge and wrote to a friend, "I am having a pretty bad time. The lab work is a terrible bore, and I am so bad at it is impossible to feel that I am learning anything." He developed an antagonistic relationship with his tutor, Patrick Blackett. While on vacation, he recalled of his friend Francis Ferguson. Oppenheimer once confessed that he had left an apple doused with noxious chemicals on Blackett's desk. While Ferguson's account is the only detailed version of this event, Oppenheimer's parents were alerted by university authorities who considered placing him on probation. His parents successfully lobbied for the authorities not to do so. Oppenheimer was a tall, thin chain smoker who often neglected to eat during periods of intense thought and concentration. Many of his friends said he had self-destructive tendencies. A disturbing event occurred when he took a vacation from his studies in Cambridge to meet up with Ferguson in Paris. Ferguson noticed that Oppenheimer was not too well. To distract him from his depression, Ferguson told Oppenheimer that he, Ferguson, was to marry his girlfriend Frances Keeley. Oppenheimer did not take this news well. He jumped on Ferguson and tried to strangle him. Although Ferguson easily fended off the attack, the episode convinced him of Oppenheimer's deep psychological troubles. Throughout his life, Oppenheimer was plagued by periods of depression, and he once told his brother, "I need physics more than friends." In 1926, Oppenheimer left Cambridge for the University of Göttingen to study under Max Born. Göttingen was one of the world's leading centers for theoretical physics. Oppenheimer made friends who went on to great success, including Werner Heisenberg, Pascual Jordan, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, Enrico Fermi, and Edward Teller. He was known for being too enthusiastic in discussion, sometimes to the point of taking over seminar sessions. This irritated some of Born's other students so much that Maria Goeppert presented Born with a petition signed by herself and others threatening the boycott of the class unless he made Oppenheimer quiet down. Born left it out on his desk where Oppenheimer could read it, and it was effective without a word being said. Oppenheimer obtained his Doctor of Philosophy degree in March 1927 at age 23, supervised by Born. After the oral exam, James Franck, the professor administering, reportedly said, "I'm glad that's over. He was on the point of questioning me." Oppenheimer published more than a dozen papers while in Europe, including many important contributions to the new field of quantum mechanics. He and Born published a famous paper on the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, which separates nuclear motion from electronic motion in the mathematical treatment of molecules, allowing nuclear motion to be neglected to simplify calculations. It remains his most cited work. Early career, educational work. Oppenheimer was awarded a United States National Research Council Fellowship to the California Institute of Technology in September 1927. Bridgman also wanted him at Harvard, so a compromise was reached whereby he split his fellowship for the 1927-28 academic year between Harvard in 1927 and Caltech in in 1928. At Caltech, he struck up a close friendship with Linus Pauling, and they planned to mount a joint attack on the nature of chemical bond, a field which Pauling was a pioneer. With Oppenheimer supplying the mathematics and Pauling interpreting the results, both the collaboration and the friendship ended when Pauling began to suspect Oppenheimer of becoming too close to his wife, Ava Helen Pauling. Once, when Pauling was at work, Oppenheimer had arrived at their home and invited Ava Helen to join him on a tryst in Mexico. Though she refused and reported the incident to her husband, the invitation and the apparent nonchalance about it disquieted Pauling, and he ended the relationship with Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer later invited him to become the head of chemistry division of the Manhattan Project, but Pauling refused, saying he was a pacifist. In the autumn of 1928, Oppenheimer visited Paul Ehrenfest's Institute at the University of Leiden, the Netherlands, where he was impressed by giving lectures in Dutch, despite having little experience with the language. There he was given the nickname of Ophe, which later angelicized by his students as Oppie. From Leiden, he continued on to the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich to work with Wolfgang Pauli on quantum mechanics and the continuous spectrum. Oppenheimer respected and liked Pauli, and may have emulated his personal style as well as critical approach to his problems. On returning to the United States, Oppenheimer accepted an associate professorship from the University of California, Berkeley, where Raymond T. Burge wanted him so badly that he expressed a willingness to share him with Caltech. Before he began his Berkeley professorship, Oppenheimer was diagnosed with a mild case of tuberculosis and spent some weeks with his brother Frank at a New Mexico ranch, which he leased and eventually purchased. When he heard the ranch was available for lease, he exclaimed "hot dog" and later called it "perro caliente," literally hot dog in Spanish. Later, he used to say that physics and desert country were his two great loves. He recovered from tuberculosis and returned to Berkeley, where he prospered as an advisor and collaborator to a generation of physicists who admired him for his intellectual veracity and broad interests. His students and colleagues saw him as mesmerizing, hypnotic in private interaction, but often frigid in more public settings. His associates fell into two camps. One saw him as aloof, an impressive genius, and aesthete. The other saw him as pretentious and insecure posture. His students almost always fell into the former category, adopting his walk, speech, and other mannerisms, and even his inclination for reading entire texts in their original languages. Hans Bethe said of him, "Probably the most important ingredient he brought to his teaching was his exquisite taste. He always knew what were the important problems, as shown by his choice of subject. He truly lived with those problems, struggling for a solution, and he communicated his concern to the group. In its heyday, there were about 8 or 10 graduate students as his group, and about 6 postdoctoral fellows. He met his group once a day in his office and discussed with one after another the status of each student's research problem. He was interested in everything, and in one afternoon they might discuss quantum electrodynamics, cosmic rays, electron pair production, and nuclear physics." Oppenheimer worked closely with Nobel Prize-winning experimental physicist Ernest O. Lawrence and his cyclotron pioneers, helping them understand the data their machines were producing at the Lawrence Berkeley International Laboratory. In 1936, Berkeley promoted him to a full professor at a salary of $3,300 a year, equivalent to $70,000 in 2022. In return, he was asked to curtail his teach at Caltech, so a compromise was reached whereby Berkeley released him for 6 weeks each year, enough to teach one term at Caltech. Scientific work. Oppenheimer did important research in theoretical astronomy, especially related to general relativity and nuclear theory, nuclear physics, spectroscopy, and quantum field theory, including its extension to quantum electrodynamics. The formal mathematics of relativistic quantum mechanics also attracted his attention. Although he doubted its validity, his work predicted many later finds, which included the neutron, meson, and neutron star. Initially, his major interest was the theory of the continuous spectrum, and his published paper in 1926 concerned the quantum theory of molecular band spectra. He developed a method to carry out its calculations, a transition probabilities. He calculated the photoelectric effect for hydrogen in X-rays, obtaining the absorption coefficient at the K-edge. His calculations accorded with the observations of the X-ray absorption of the sun, but not helium. Years later, it was realized that the sun was largely composed of hydrogen, and that his calculations were correct. Oppenheimer made important contributions to the theory of cosmic ray showers and started the work that eventually led to descriptions of quantum tunneling. In 1931, he co-wrote a paper on the relativistic theory of photoelectric effect with his student Harvey Hall, in which, based on empirical evidence, he correctly disputed Dirac's assertion that two of the energy levels of the hydrogen atom have the same energy. Subsequently, one of his doctoral students, Willis Lamb, determined that this was a consequence of what became known as the Lamb shift, for which Lamb was awarded the Nobel Prize Physics in 1955. With his first doctoral student, Melba Phillips, Oppenheimer worked on calculations of artificial radioactivity under bombardment by deuterons. While Ernest Lawrence and Edward Macmillan bombarded nuclei with deuterons, they found the results agreed closely with the predictions of George Gamow. But when higher energies and heavier nuclei were involved, the results did not conform to the theory. In 1935, Oppenheimer and Phillips worked out a theory, known now as the Oppenheimer-Phillips process, to explain the results. This theory is still in use today. As early as 1930, Oppenheimer wrote a paper that essentially predicted the existence of the positron. This was after a paper by Paul Dirac proposed that electrons could have both a positive charge and negative energy. Dirac's paper introduced an equation known as the Dirac equation that unified quantum mechanics, special relativity, and the then new concept of electron spin to explain the Zeeman effect. Oppenheimer, drawing on the body of experimental evidence, rejected the idea that the predicted positively charged electrons were protons. He argued that they would have the same mass as an electron, whereas experiments show that protons were much heavier than electrons. 2 years later, Carl David Anderson discovered the positron, for which he received the 1936 Nobel Prize in Physics. In the late 1930s, Oppenheimer became interested in astrophysics, most likely through his friendship with Richard Tolman, resulting in a series of papers. In the first one of these, a 1938 paper co-written with Robert Serber titled On the Stability of Stellar Neuron Cores, Oppenheimer explored the properties of white dwarfs. This was followed by a paper co-written with one of his students, George Volkoff, on massive neuron cores, in which they demonstrated that there was a limit, the so-called Tolman-Oppenheimer-Volkoff limit, to the mass of stars which they would not remain stable as neutron stars and would undergo gravitational collapse. In 1939, Oppenheimer and another one of his students, Hartland Snyder, produced the paper on continued gravitational contraction, which predicted the existence of what today are known as black holes. After the Born-Oppenheimer approximation paper, these papers remain almost his most cited and were the key factors in the rejuvenation of astrophysical research in the United States in the 1950s, mainly by John A. Wheeler. Oppenheimer's papers were considered difficult to understand even by the standards of abstract topics he was an expert in. He was fond of using elegant, if extremely complex, mathematical techniques to demonstrate physical principles, though he was sometimes criticized for making mathematical mistakes, presumably out of haste. His physics was good, said his student Snyder, but his arithmetic was awful. After World War II, Oppenheimer published only 5 scientific papers, one of which was in biophysics and none after 1950. Murray Gell-Mann, a later Nobelist who, as a visiting scientist, worked with him at the Institute for Advanced Study in 1951, offered this opinion. He didn't have Sitzfleisch, sitting flesh, when you sit on a chair, as far as I know. He never wrote a long paper, did a long calculation, or anything of that kind. He didn't have the patience for that. His own work consisted of little apercus, but quite brilliant ones. But he inspired other people to do things, and his influence was fantastic. Private and political life. During the 1920s, Oppenheimer remained uniformed on worldly matters. He claimed that he did not read newspapers or popular magazines and only learned of the Wall Street crash of 1929 while he was on a walk with Ernest Lawrence 6 months after the crash occurred. He once remarked that he never cast a vote until the 1936 presidential election. From 1934 on, he became increasingly concerned about politics and international affairs. In 1934, he earmarked 3% of his annual salary, about 100, equivalent to $2,188 in 2022, for 2 years to support German physicists fleeing Nazi Germany. During the 1934 West Coast waterfront strike, he and some of his students, including Melba Phillips and Bob Serber, attended a longshoremen's rally. Oppenheimer repeatedly attempted to get Serber a position at Berkeley, but was blocked by Birch, who felt that one Jew in the department was enough. Oppenheimer's mother died in 1931, and he became closer to his father, who, although still living in New York, became a frequent visitor in California. When his father died in 1937, leaving $392,602 to be divided between Oppenheimer and his brother Frank, Oppenheimer immediately wrote out a will that left his estate to the University of California to be used for graduate scholarships. Like many intellectuals in the 1930s, Oppenheimer supported social reforms that were later alleged to be communist ideas. He donated to many progressive causes that were branded as left-wing during the McCarthy era. The majority of his allegedly radical work consisted of hosting fundraisers for the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War and other anti-fascist activity. He never openly joined the Communist Party USA, though he did pass money to leftist causes by way of acquaintances who were alleged to be party members. When he joined the Manhattan Project in 1942, Oppenheimer wrote his personal security questionnaire that he had been a member of just about every communist front organization on the West Coast. Years later, he claimed that he did not remember saying this, that it was not true, and that if he had done anything along those lines, it was a half jocular overstatement. He was a subscriber to People's World, a Communist Party organ, and testified in 1954, "I was associated with the communist movement from 1937 to 1942. Oppenheimer was a member at Berkeley of what he called a discussion group, which was later identified by fellow members Hakon Chevalier and Gordon Griffiths of a closed secret unit of the Communist Party for Berkeley faculty." The FBI opened a file on Oppenheimer in March 1941. It recorded that he attended a meeting in 1940 at Chevalier's home that was also attended by the Communist Party's California State Secretary William Schneiderman and its treasurer Isaac Volkov. The FBI noted that Oppenheimer was on the executive committee of the American Civil Liberties Union, which it considered a communist front organization. Shortly thereafter, the FBI added Oppenheimer to its custodial detention index for arrest in case of national security. Debates over Oppenheimer's party membership, or lack thereof, had turned on very fine points. Almost all historians agree that he had strong left-wing views during this time and interacted with party members, but it is disputed whether he was officially a member of the party. At his 1954 security clearance hearings, he denied being a member of the Communist Party, but identified himself as a fellow traveler, which he defined as someone who agrees with many of communism's goals, but is not willing to blindly follow orders from any Communist Party apparatus. In 1943, he volunteered to Manhattan Project security agents that George Eltonton, whom he did not know, had solicited 3 men at Los Alamos for nuclear secrets on behalf of the Soviet Union. When he pressed on the issue in later interviews, Oppenheimer admitted that the only person who had approached him was his friend Hakon Chevalier, a Berkeley professor of French literature, who had mentioned the matter privately at a dinner at Oppenheimer's house. Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, Jr., the director of the Manhattan Project, thought Oppenheimer was too important to the project to be ousted over this suspicious behavior. On July 20th, 1943, he wrote to the Manhattan Engineer District, "In accordance with my verbal directions of July 15th, it is desired that clearance be issued to Julius Robert Oppenheimer without delay, irrespective of the information which you have concerning Mr. Oppenheimer. He is absolutely essential to the project." Relationships and children. In 1936, Oppenheimer became involved with Jean Tatlock, the daughter of a Berkeley literature professor and a student at Stanford University School of Medicine. The two had similar political views. She wrote for The Western Worker, a Communist Party newspaper. In 1939, after a tempestuous relationship, Tatlock broke up with Oppenheimer. In August of that year, he met Catherine, Kitty, Puning, a radical Berkeley student and former Communist Party member. Kitty had been married before. Her first marriage lasted only a few months. Her second common-law marriage husband was Joe Dale, an active member of the Communist Party who was killed in the Spanish War. Kitty returned to the United States, where she obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree in botany from the University of Pennsylvania. There she married Richard Harrison, a physician and medical researcher, in 1938. In June 1939, Kitty and Harrison moved to Pasadena, California, where he became chief of radiology at a local hospital, and she enrolled as a graduate student at the University of California, Los Angeles. Oppenheimer and Kitty created a minor scandal by sleeping together after one of Tolman's parties in the summer of 1940. She stayed with Oppenheimer at his ranch in New Mexico and finally asked Harrison for a divorce when she found out she was pregnant. When he refused, she obtained a quick divorce in Reno, Nevada, and took Oppenheimer as her fourth husband on November 1st, 1940. Their first child, Peter, was born in May 1941, and their second, Catherine, Tony, was born in Los Alamos, New Mexico on December 7th, 1944. During his marriage, Oppenheimer rekindled his affair with Tatlock. Later, their continued contact became an issue in his security clearance hearings because of Tatlock's communist associations. Throughout the development of the atomic bomb, Oppenheimer was under investigation by both the FBI and the Manhattan Project's internal security arm for his past left-wing associations. He was followed by Army security agents during a trip to California in June 1943 to visit Tatlock, who was suffering from depression. Oppenheimer spent the night in her apartment. Tatlock committed suicide on January 4th, 1944, leaving Oppenheimer deeply grieved. Many of Oppenheimer's closest associates were active in the Communist Party in the 1930s and the 1940s, including his brother Frank, Frank's wife Jackie, Kitty, Tatlock, and his landlady Mary Ellen Washburn, and several graduate students at Berkeley. Mysticism. Oppenheimer's diverse interests sometimes interrupted his focus on science. He liked things that were difficult, and since much of the scientific work appeared easy for him, he developed an interest in the mystical and the cryptic. After going to Harvard, he began to acquaint himself with the classical Hindu texts through their English translation. He also had an interest in learning languages and learned Sanskrit under Arthur W. Ryder at Berkeley in 1933. He eventually read the Hindu scriptures such as Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads in their original Sanskrit and deeply pondered them. He later cited the Gita as one of the books that shaped his philosophy of life. He wrote to his brother that the Gita was very easy and quite marvelous, and called the text the most beautiful philosophical song existing in any known tongue. He would later give copies of the text as a present to his friends and keep his personal worn-out copy on the bookshelf close to his desk. He even nicknamed his car as Garuda, the mounted bird of the Hindu god Vishnu. Nonetheless, Oppenheimer never became a Hindu in the traditional sense. He did not join any temple nor pray to any god. He was really taken by the charm and general wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita, said his brother. Oppenheimer's interest in Hindu thought is speculated to have started with his earlier association with Niels Bohr. Both Bohr and Oppenheimer had been very analytical and critical about the ancient Hindu mythological stories and the metaphysics embedded in them. In one conversation with David Hawkins before the war, while talking about the literature of ancient Greece, Oppenheimer remarked, "I have read the Greeks, I find the Hindus deeper." His close and confident colleague, Nobel Prize winner Isidore Rabi, who had seen Oppenheimer throughout his Berkeley, Los Alamos, and Princeton years, once questioning why men of Oppenheimer's gifts do not discover everything worth discovering. He reflected that Oppenheimer was overeducated in those fields which lie outside the scientific tradition, such as an interest in religion, and the Hindu religion in particular, which resulted in feeling for the mystery of the universe that surrounded him almost like a fog. He saw physics clearly, looking toward what he had already done, but at the border he tended to feel that there was much more mysterious and novel than there actually was. He turned away from the hard, crude methods of theoretical physics into a mystical realm of broad intuition. In Oppenheimer, the basis of his charisma. He never expressed himself completely. He was always feeling that there were depths of sensibility and insight not yet revealed. These may be qualities of the born leader who seems to have reserves of uncommitted strength. In spite of this, observers such as the Nobel Prize winning physicist Luis Alvarez have suggested that if he lived long enough to see his predictions substantiated by experiment, Oppenheimer might have won a Nobel Prize for his work on gravitational collapse, concerning neutron stars and black holes. In retrospect, some physicists and historians consider this his most important contribution, though it is not taken up by other scientists in his lifetime. The physicist and historian Abraham Pius once asked Oppenheimer what he considered his most scientific contributions. Oppenheimer cited his work on electrons and positrons, not his work on gravitational contraction. Oppenheimer was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Physics 3 times in 1946, 1951, and 1967, but never won. The Manhattan Project. Los Alamos. On October 9th, 1941, 2 months before the United States entered World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved a cash program to develop an atomic bomb. In May 1942, the National Defense Research Committee Chairman James B. Conant, who had been one of Oppenheimer's lecturers at Harvard, invited Oppenheimer to take over work on fast neuron calculations, a task Oppenheimer threw himself into with full vigor. He was given the title Coordinator of Rapid Rupture, which specifically referred to the propagation of a fast neuron chain and reaction in an atomic bomb. One of his first acts was to host a summer school for the bomb theory at his building in Berkeley. The mix of European physicists and his own students, including Robert Serber, Emil Konopinski, Felix Bach, Hans Bethe, and Edward Teller kept themselves busy by calculating what needed to be done and in what order to make the bomb. In June 1942, the U.S. Army established the Manhattan Engineer District to handle its part in the atom bomb project, beginning the process of transferring responsibility from the Office of Scientific Research and Development to the military. In September, Leslie Groves was appointed director of what became known as the Manhattan Project. He selected Oppenheimer to head the project's secret weapons laboratory. This choice surprised many because Oppenheimer had left-wing political views and no record as leader of large projects. Grove was concerned by the fact that Oppenheimer did not have a Nobel Prize and might not have the prestige to direct fellow scientists. How much more we got left? Alright, let's keep going. Groves was impressed by Oppenheimer's singular grasp of the practical aspects of designing and constructing an atomic bomb, and by the breadth of his knowledge as a military engineer. Groves knew that this would be vital in an interdisciplinary project that would involve not just physics, but chemistry, metallurgy, ordnance, and engineering. Groves also detected in Oppenheimer something that many others did not, an overweening ambition that Groves reckoned would supply the drive necessary to push the project to a successful conclusion. Isidore Rabi considered the appointment a real stroke of genius on the part of General Groves, who is not generally considered to be a genius. Oppenheimer and Groves decided that for security and cohesion they needed a centralized secret research laboratory in a remote location. Scouting for a site in late 1942, Oppenheimer was drawn to New Mexico, not far from his ranch. On November 16, 1942, Oppenheimer, Groves, and others toured a prospective site. Oppenheimer feared that the high cliffs surrounding his site would make people feel claustrophobic, while the engineers were concerned with the possibility of flooding. He then suggested and championed a site that he knew well, a flat mesa near Santa Fe, New Mexico, which was the site of a private boys' school, the Los Alamos Ranch School. The engineers were concerned about the poor access road and the water supply, but otherwise felt that it was ideal. The Los Alamos Laboratory was built on the site of the school, taking over some of its buildings, while many new buildings were erected in great haste. At the laboratory, Oppenheimer assembled a group of the top physicists of the time, which he called the luminaries. Los Alamos was initially supposed to be a military laboratory, and Oppenheimer and other researchers were commissioned into the army. He went so far as to order himself a lieutenant colonel's uniform and take the army physical test, which he failed. Doctors considered him underweight at 128 pounds, which is 58 kilograms, diagnosed his chronic cough as tuberculosis, and were concerned about his chronic lumbosacral joint pain. The plan to commission scientists fell through when Rabbi and Robert Bacher balked at the idea. Content Groves and Oppenheimer devised a compromise whereby the laboratory was operated by the University of California under contract to the War Department. It soon turned out that Oppenheimer had hugely underestimated the magnitude of the project. Los Alamos grew from a few hundred people in 1943 to over 6,000 in 1945. I can't see. Oppenheimer at first had difficulty with the organizational division of large groups, but rapidly learned the art of large-scale administration after he took up permanent residence on the Mesa. He was noted for his mastery of all scientific aspects of the project and for his efforts to control the inevitable cultural conflicts between scientists and the military. He was an iconic figure to his fellow students, as much of a symbol of what they were working toward as a scientific director. Victor Weisskopf put it thus: Oppenheimer directed these studies, theoretical and experimental, in the real sense of words. Here his uncanny speed in grasping the main points of any subject was a decisive factor. He could acquaint himself with the essential details of every part of the work. He did not direct from the head office. He was intellectually and physically present at each decisive step. He was present in the laboratory or in the seminar rooms when a new effect was measured, when a new idea was conceived. It was not that he contributed so many ideas or suggestions. He did so sometimes, but his main influence came from something else. It was continuous in his intense presence, which he produced as a sense of direct participation in all of us. It created that unique atmosphere of enthusiasm and challenge that pervaded the space throughout its time. At this point in the war, there was considerable anxiety among the scientists that the Germans might be making faster progress on an atomic weapon than they were. In a letter dated May 25th, 1943, Oppenheimer responded to a proposal by Fermi to use radioactive materials to poison German food supplies. Oppenheimer asked Fermi whether he could produce enough strontium without letting too many in on the secret. Oppenheimer continued, I think we should not attempt a plan unless we can poison food sufficient to kill 500,000 men. In 1943, development efforts were directed to a plutonium gun-type fission weapon called Thin Man. Initial research on the properties of plutonium were done using cyclotron-generated plutonium-239, which was extremely pure but could only be created in tiny amounts. When Los Alamos received the first sample of plutonium from the X-10 graphite reactor in April 1944, a problem was discovered. Reactor-bred plutonium has a higher concentration of plutonium-240, making it unsuitable for use in a gun-type weapon. In July 1944, Oppenheimer abandoned the gun design in favor of an implosion-type weapon. Using chemical explosive lenses, a subcritical sphere of fissile material could be squeezed into a smaller and denser form. The metal needed to travel only very short distances, so the critical mass would be assembled in much less time. In August 1944, Oppenheimer implemented a sweeping reorganization of the Los Alamos laboratory to focus on implosion. He concentrated the development efforts on the gun-type device, a simpler design that only had to work with uranium-235 in a single group. This device became Little Boy in February 1945. After a mammoth research effort, the more complex design of the implosion device, known as the Christie gadget, after Robert Christie and other students of Oppenheimer's, was finalized in a meeting in Oppenheimer's office of February 28, 1945. In May 1945, an interim committee was created to advise and report on wartime and post-war policies regarding the use of nuclear energy. The interim committee established a scientific panel consisting of Oppenheimer, Arthur Compton, Fermi, and Lawrence to advise it on scientific issues. In its presentation to the interim committee, the panel offered its opinion not just on atomic bombs' likely physical effects, but on its likely military and political impact. This included opinions on such sensitive issues as whether the Soviet Union should be advised of the weapon in advance of its use against Japan. Trinity. The joint work of the scientists at Los Alamos resulted in the world's first nuclear explosion near Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16, 1945. Oppenheimer had given the site the codename Trinity in mid-1944 and said later that it was from one of John Donne's holy sonnets. According to historian Greg Herkin, this naming could have been an allusion to Jean Tatlock, who had committed suicide a few months before and had, in the 1930s, introduced Oppenheimer to Donne's work. Oppenheimer later recalled that while witnessing the explosion, he thought of a verse from Bhagavad Gita 11:12? Yeah, we'll go with that. If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be the splendor of the mighty one. Years later, he said that another verse had entered his head at the time. This 11:32, I think, which translated to as "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In 1965, he was later persuaded to quote it again for a television broadcast. He said, "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed. A few people cried. Most people were silent. I remember the line from the Hindu scripture, Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.' I suppose we all thought that, one way or another." Among those present with Oppenheimer in the control bunker at the site were his brother Frank and Brigadier General Thomas Farrell. When Jeremy Bernstein asked Frank what Robert's first words were after the test, the answer was, "I guess it worked." Farrell summarized Robert's reaction as follows. Dr. Oppenheimer, on whom had rested a very heavy burden, grew tenser as the last seconds ticked off. He scarcely breathed. He held on to his post to steady himself. For the last few seconds he stared directly ahead, and then when the announcer shouted, "Now," and there came this tremendous burst of light, followed shortly thereafter by the deep growling roar of the explosion, his face relaxed into an expression of tremendous relief. Rabi noticed Oppenheimer's disconcerting triumphalism. I'll never forget his walk. I'll never forget the way he stepped out of the car. His walk was like high noon, this kind of strut. He had done it. At an assembly at Los Alamos on August 6th, the evening of the atomic bomb of Hiroshima, Oppenheimer took to the stage and clasped his hands together like a prize-winning boxer while the crowd cheered. He noted his regret the weapon had not been available in time to use against Nazi Germany, but he and many of the project staff were very upset about the bombing of Nagasaki, as they did not feel the second bomb was necessary from a military point of view. He traveled to Washington on August 17th to hand-deliver a letter to Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, expressing his revulsion and his wish to see nuclear weapons banned. In October 1945, Oppenheimer was granted an interview with President Harry S. Truman. The meeting went badly after Oppenheimer said he felt he had blood on my hands. The remark infuriated Truman and put an end to the meeting. Truman later told his Undersecretary of State, Dean Acheson, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again." For his services as director of Los Alamos, Oppenheimer was rewarded the Medal for Merit by President Truman in 1946. Post-war activities. The Manhattan Project was top secret and did not become public knowledge until after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Oppenheimer had become a national spokesman for science who was emblematic of a new type of technocratic power. He became a household name, and his portrait appeared on the covers of Life and Time. Nuclear physics became a powerful force for all governments as the world began to realize that the strategic and political power that came with nuclear weapons. Like many scientists of this generation, he felt that security from atomic bombs would come only from a transnational organization such as the newly formed United Nations, which could institute a program to stifle a nuclear arms race. Institute for Advanced Study. In November 1945, Oppenheimer left Los Alamos to return to Caltech, but soon found that his heart was no longer in teaching. In 1947, he accepted an offer from Louis Strauss to take up directorship of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. This meant moving back east and leaving Ruth Tolman, the wife of his friend Richard Tolman, with whom he had begun an affair with after leaving Alamos. The job came with a salary of $20,000 per annum, plus rent-free accommodation in the director's house, a 17th-century manor with a cook and a groundskeeper, surrounded by 265 acres of woodlands. He collected European furniture and French post-impressionist and Fauvist works. His art collection included works by Cézanne, Derain, Despaux, de Vlaminck, Picasso, Rembrandt, Renoir, Van Gogh, and Vuillard. Oppenheimer brought together intellectuals at the height of their powers and from a variety of disciplines to answer the most pertinent questions of the age. He directed and encouraged the research of many well-known scientists, including Freeman Dyson and the duo of Chen-Ning Yang and Sung-Dao Lee, who won a Nobel Prize for the discovery of parity non-conservation. He also instituted a temporary memberships for scholars from the humanities, such as T.S. Eliot and George F. Kennan. Some of these activities were resented by a few members of the mathematics faculty, who wanted the Institute to stay a bastion of pure scientific research. Abraham Pais said that Oppenheimer himself thought that one of his failures at the Institute was being unable to bring together scholars from the natural sciences and humanities. During a series of conferences in New York from 1947 through 1949, physicists switched back from war work to theoretical issues. Under Oppenheimer's direction, physicists tackled the outstanding problem of pre-wars, infinite divergent and nonsensical expressions, and quantum electrodynamics of elementary particles. Julian Schwinger, Richard Feynman, Shinichiro Tomonaga tackled the problem of regularization and developed techniques that became known as renormalization. Freeman Dyson was able to prove that procedures gave similar results. The problem of meson absorption and Hideki Yukawa's theory of mesons as the carrier particles of the strong nuclear force were also tackled. Probing questions from Oppenheimer prompted Robert Marshak's innovative two-meson hypothesis that there were actually two types of mesons, pions and muons. This led Cecil Franks Powell's breakthrough and subsequent Nobel Prize for the discovery of the pion. As a member of the Board of Atomic Energy Commission. As a member of the Board of Consultants to the committee appointed by Truman, Oppenheimer strongly influenced the Achison-Lilithanel report. In this report, the committee advocated the creation of the International Atomic Development Authority, which would own all fissionable material and means of its production, such as mines and laboratories and atomic power plants, where it could be used for peaceful energy production. Bernard Baruch was appointed to translate this report into a proposal for the United Nations, resulting in a Baruch Plan of 1942. The Baruch Plan introduced many additional provisions regarding enforcement, in particular requiring inspections of the Soviets' uranium sources. It was clear it was an attempt to maintain the United States' nuclear monopoly and rejected by the Soviets. With this, it became clear to Oppenheimer that an arms race was unavoidable, due to the mutual suspicion of the United States and the Soviet Union, which even Oppenheimer was starting to distrust. After the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, came into being in 1947 as a civilian energy and control of nuclear research and weapons issues, Oppenheimer was appointed the chairman of its General Advisory Committee, GAC. From this position, he advised on a number of nuclear-related issues, including project funding, laboratory construction, and even international policy. Though the GAC's advice was not always needed, as the chairman of the GAC, Oppenheimer lobbied vigorously for international arms control and funding for basic science, and attempted to influence policy away from a heated arms race. The first atomic bomb test by the Soviet Union in August 1949 came earlier than the Americans expected, and over the next several months was an intense debate with the U.S. government, military, and scientific communities over whether to proceed with the development of the far more powerful nuclear fusion-based hydrogen bomb known as the Super. Oppenheimer had been aware of a possibility of a thermonuclear weapon since the days of the Manhattan Project, and had allocated a limited amount of theoretical research toward the possibility at the time, but nothing more than that. Given the pressing need to develop a fission weapon immediately following the end of the war, Oppenheimer argued against continuing work on the Super at the time, due to both lack and need of enormous human casualties that would result from its use. Now in October 1949, Oppenheimer and the GAC recommended against the development of the Super. He and other GAC members were motivated partly by ethical concerns, feeling that such a weapon could only be strategically used, resulting in millions of deaths. Its use, therefore, carries much further than the atomic bomb itself, the policy of exterminating civilian populations. They also had practical qualms, as there was no workable design for the hydrogen bomb at the time. Regarding the possibility of the Soviet Union developing a thermonuclear weapon, the GAC felt that the United States could have an adequate stockpile of atomic weapons to retaliate against any thermonuclear attack. In that connection, Oppenheimer and others were concerned about the opportunity cost that would be incurred if nuclear reactors were diverted from materials needed for an atom bomb production to the materials such as tritium needed for the thermonuclear weapon. A majority of AEC subsequently endorsed the GAC recommendation, and Oppenheimer thought that the fight against the Super would triumph, but proponents of the weapon lobbied the White House vigorously. On January 31st, 1950, Truman, who was predisposed to proceed with the development of the weapon anyway, made the formal decision to do so. Oppenheimer and the other GAC opponents of the project, especially James Contant, felt disheartened and considered resigning from the committee. They stayed on, though their views of the hydrogen bomb are well known. In 1951, Edward Teller and mathematician Stanislaw Ulam developed what is known as the Teller-Ulam design for the hydrogen bomb. This new design seemed technically feasible, and Oppenheimer officially acceded to the weapon's development, while still looking for ways in its testing or development or use could be questioned, as he later recalled. The program he had in 1949 was a tortured thing if you could well argue that it did not make a great deal of technical sense. It was therefore possible to argue that you also did not want it even if you could have it. The program in 1951 was technically so sweet that you could not argue about that. The issues became purely the military, the political, and humane problem of what you were going to do about it once you had it. Oppenheimer, Contant, and Lee Dubridge, another member who had opposed the H-bomb decision, left the GAC when their terms expired in August 1952. Truman had to decline to reappoint them, as he wanted new voices on the committee who were more in support of the H-bomb development. In addition, various opponents of Oppenheimer had communicated to Truman their desire that Oppenheimer leave the committee. Alright, we're almost there. Security hearing. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had been following Oppenheimer since before the war, when he showed communist sympathies as a professor at Berkeley and had been close to members of the Communist Party, including his wife and brother. They strongly suspected that he himself was a member of the party, based on wiretaps in which party members referred to him or appeared to refer to him as a communist, as well as reports from informers within the party. He had been under close surveillance since the early 1940s, his home and office bugged, his phone tapped, and his mail opened. The FBI furnished Oppenheimer's political enemies with evidence that implicated communist ties. These enemies included Strauss, an AAC commissioner who had long harbored resentment against Oppenheimer for both his activity in opposing the hydrogen bomb and for his humiliation of Strauss before Congress some years earlier. Strauss had expressed opposition to exporting radioactive isotopes to other nations, and Oppenheimer had called them less than important electronic devices, but more important than, let's say, vitamins. On June 7th, 1949, Oppenheimer testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee that he had associations with the Communist Party in the USA in the 1930s. He testified that some of his students, including David Bond, Giovanni Rossi Lamanitz, Philip Morrison, Bernard Peters, and Joseph Weinberg, had been communists before they had worked with him at Berkeley. At the time, they had worked with him at Berkeley. Frank Oppenheimer and his wife Jackie testified before the HUAC that they had been members of the Communist Party USA. Frank was subsequently fired from his University of Minnesota position. Unable to find work in physics for many years, he became a cattle rancher in Colorado. He later taught high school physics and was the founder of the San Francisco Exploratorium. The trigger event for the security hearing happened on November 7th, 1953, when William Lipscomb Borden, who until earlier that in the year had been the executive director I lost my spot. Of United States Congress Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, sent him over a letter saying that more probably than not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is an agent of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower never exactly believed the allegations in the letter, but felt compelled to move forward with an investigation. And on December 3rd, he ordered that a blank wall be placed between Oppenheimer and any government or military secrets. On December 21st, 1953, Strauss told Oppenheimer that a security clearance had been suspended, pending resolution of a series of charges outlined in a letter and discussed by his resigning by way of requesting termination of his contract with the AAC. Oppenheimer chose not to resign and requested a hearing instead. The charges were outlined in a letter from Kenneth D. Nichols, the general manager of the AAC. The hearing that followed in April to May of 1954, which was held in secret, focused on Oppenheimer's past communist ties and his association during the Manhattan Project with suspected disloyal or communist scientists. He then continued with an examination of Oppenheimer's opposition to the H-bomb and stances in subsequent projects and study groups. A transcript of the hearings was published in June 1954 with some redactions. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Energy made the full transcript public. One of the key elements in this hearing was Oppenheimer's earliest testimony about George Eltonton's approach to various Los Alamos scientists, a story that Oppenheimer confessed he had fabricated to project his friend Hakon Chevalier. Unknown to Oppenheimer, both versions were recorded during his interrogations of a decade before. He was surprised on the witness stand with transcripts which he had not been given a chance to review. In fact, Oppenheimer had never told Chevalier that he had finally named him, and the testimony had lost Chevalier his job. Both Chevalier and Eltonton confirmed, mentioning that they had a way to get information to the Soviets. Eltonton admitting he said this to Chevalier, and Chevalier admitting he mentioned it to Oppenheimer. But both put the matter in terms of gossip and denied any thought or suggestion of treason or thoughts of espionage, either in planning or in deed. Neither was never convicted of any crime. Teller testified he considered Oppenheimer loyal to the U.S. government, but that in a great number of cases I have seen Dr. Oppenheimer act, and I understand that Dr. Oppenheimer acted in a way which was made for exceedingly hard to understand. I thoroughly disagreed with him in numerous issues, and his actions frankly appeared to me confused and complicated. To this extent, I feel that I would like to see vital interests of this country in the hands which I understand better, and therefore trust more. In a very limited sense, I would like to express a feeling that I would personally be more secure if public matters rest in other hands. This led to outrage by the scientific community and Teller's virtual expulsion from academic science. Ernest Lawrence refused to testify on the grounds that he was suffering from an attack of ulcerative colitis, but in an interview transcript which he condemned Oppenheimer and presented evidence in his absence. Groves, threatened by the FBI, having been potentially a part of a cover-up about the Chevalier contact in 1943, likewise testified against Oppenheimer. Many top scientists, as well as government and military figures, testified on Oppenheimer's behalf. Inconsistencies in this testimony and his erratic behavior on the stand, at one point saying he had given a cock and bull story, and this was because he was an idiot, convinced some that he was unstable, unreliable, and a possible security risk. Oppenheimer's clearance was revoked one day before it was due to lapse anyway. Rabi commented that Oppenheimer was merely a government consultant at the time anyway, and that the government didn't want to consult the guy, then don't consult him. During his meeting, Oppenheimer testified willingly on the left-wing activities of many of his scientific colleagues. Had Oppenheimer's clearance not been stripped, he might have been remembered as someone who had named names to save his own reputation. As it happened, Oppenheimer was seen by most of the scientific community as a martyr to McCarthyism, an eclectic liberal who unjustly attacked by warmongering enemies symbolic of the shift of scientific creativity from the academia to the military. Werner von Braun summed up his opinion about the matter with a quip to congressional committee in England. Oppenheimer would have been knighted. In a seminar at the Wilson Center in 2009, based on an extensive analysis of the Vasiliev books taken from the KGB archives, John Earl Haynes, Harvey Clear, and Alexander Vasiliev confirmed that Oppenheimer was never involved in espionage for the Soviet Union. Soviet intelligence tried to repeatedly recruit him, but was never successful. Oppenheimer did not spy on the United States. In addition, he had several persons removed from the Manhattan Project who had sympathies to the Soviet Union. Haynes, Clare, and Vasiliev also state Oppenheimer was, in fact, a concealed member of the CPUSA in the late 1930s, according to biographer Ray Monk. He was very practical, in real sense, a supporter of the Communist Party. Moreover, in terms of the time, effort, and money spent on the party activities, he was a very committed supporter. On December 16, 2022, the United States Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm vacated the 1954 revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance. Her statement said in 1954 the Atomic Energy Commission revoked Dr. Oppenheimer's security clearance through a flawed process that violated the Commission's own regulations. As time has passed, more evidence has come to light of the bias and unfairness of the process that Dr. Oppenheimer was subjected to, while the evidence of his loyalty and his love of country have only been further affirmed. Okay. Final years and death. Starting in 1954, Oppenheimer lived for several months on the year on the island of St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. In 1957, he purchased a 2-acre tract of land on Gibney Beach where he built a Spartan home on the beach. He spent a considerable time sailing with his daughter Toni and his wife Kitty. Oppenheimer's first public appearance following the stripping of his security clearance was a lecture titled Prospects in the Arts and Sciences for the Columbia University Bicentennial Radio Show Man's Right to Knowledge, in which he had outlined his philosophy and his thoughts on the role of science in the modern world. He has been selected for the final episode of the lecture series 2 years prior to the security hearing, though the university remained adamant that he stay on even after the controversy. In February 1955, the president of the University of Washington, Henry Schmitz, abruptly canceled an invitation to Oppenheimer to deliver a series of lectures there. Schmitz's decision caused an uproar among the students. 1,200 of them signed a petition protesting the decision, and Schmitz was burned in effigy. While they marched in protest, the state of Washington outlawed the Communist Party and required all government employees to swear a loyalty oath. Edwin Ulbrich Uhling, the chairman of the physics department and a colleague of Oppenheimer's from Berkeley, appeared to the university senate, and Schmitz's decision was overturned by a vote of 56 to 40. Oppenheimer stopped briefly in Seattle to change planes on a trip to Oregon and was joined for coffee during his layover by several University of Washington faculty, but Oppenheimer never lectured there. Oppenheimer was increasingly concerned about the potential danger of scientific inventions could pose to humanity. He joined with Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, Joseph Rotblat, and other eminent scientists and academics to establish what would eventually, in 1960, become the World Academy of Art and Science. Significantly after his public humiliation, he did not go to the major open protests against nuclear weapons of the 1950s, including the Russell-Einstein Manifesto of 1955, nor, though invited, did he attend the first Pugwash conferences on science and world affairs in 1957. In his speeches and writings, Oppenheimer continuously stressed the difficulty of managing power and knowledge in a world with the freedom and science to exchange ideas was more and more hobbled by political concerns. Oppenheimer delivered the Reith Lectures on the BBC in 1953, which were subsequently published as Science and Common Understanding. In 1955, Oppenheimer published The Open Mind, a collection of 8 lectures that he had given since 1946 on the subject of nuclear weapons and popular culture. Oppenheimer rejected the idea of nuclear gunboat diplomacy. The purposes of this country in the field of foreign policy, he wrote, cannot in any real or enduring way be achieved by coercion. In 1957, the philosophy and psychology departments at Harvard invited Oppenheimer to deliver the William James Lectures, an influential group of Harvard's alumni, led by Edwin Ginn, that introduced Archibald Roosevelt, protested the decision. 1,200 people attended Oppenheimer's 6 lectures, The Hope of Order in Sanders Theater. In 1962, Oppenheimer delivered the Wyndham Lectures at Macassar University, which were published in 1964 as The Flying Trapeze, 3 Crises for Physicists. Deprived of political power, Oppenheimer continued to lecture and write and work on physics. He toured Europe and Japan, giving talks about the history of science, the role of science in society, and the nature of the universe. Oppenheimer spoke about the importance of studying history and the dedication of the Niels Bohr Library and the archives of the American Institute of Physics in September 1963. In September 1957, France made him an officer of the Legion of Honor. And on May 3rd, 1962, he was elected as a foreign member of the Royal Society of Britain. At the urging of many of Oppenheimer's political friends who ascended to power, President John F. Kennedy awarded Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award in 1963 as a gesture of political rehabilitation. Teller, the winner of the previous year's award, had also recommended Oppenheimer receive it, and in the hope that it would heal the rift between them. A little over a week after Kennedy's assassination, his successor, President Lyndon Johnson, presented Oppenheimer with the award for contributions to theoretical physics as a teacher and originator of ideas, and for the leadership of the Los Alamos Laboratory and the atomic energy program during critical years. Oppenheimer told Johnson, I think it is just possible, Mr. President, that it has taken some charity and some courage for you to make this award today. The rehabilitation implied that the award was partly symbolic, as Oppenheimer still lacked security clearance and would have no effect on political policy. But the award came with a $50,000 tax-free stipend, and its award outraged many prominent Republicans in Congress. The late President Kennedy's widow, Jacqueline, still living in the White House, made it a point to meet with Oppenheimer to tell him how much her husband had wanted him to have the medal. While still a senator in 1959, Kennedy had been instrumental in voting narrowly deny Oppenheimer's enemy, Louis Strauss, a coveted government professional, as Secretary of Commerce, effectively ending Strauss's political career. This was partly due to lobbying by the scientific community on behalf of Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was a chain smoker and was diagnosed with throat cancer in the late 1965. After an inconclusive surgery, he underwent unsuccessful radiation treatment and chemotherapy late in 1966. He fell into a coma on February 15, 1967, and died at his home in Princeton, New Jersey. On February 18, age 62, a memorial service was held a week later at Alexander Hall on the campus of Princeton University. The service was attended by 600 of his scientific, political, and military associates, which included Beth Groves, Keenan, Lithinal, Rabbi Smith, and Wigner. His brother Frank and the rest of his family were there, as was the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., the novelist John O'Hara, and George Balanchine. Beth, Keenan, and Smith gave brief eulogies. Oppenheimer's body was cremated and the ashes placed in an urn. His wife took the ashes to St. John and dropped the urn into the sea within sight of the beach house. In October 1972, Kitty died, age 62, from an intestinal infection complicated by a pulmonary embolism. Oppenheimer's ranch in New Mexico was then inherited by their son Peter, and the beach property was inherited by their daughter Toni Oppenheimer. Sober. Toni was refused security clearance for her chosen vocation as a United Nations translator after the FBI brought up the old charges against her father. In January 1977, 3 months after the end of her second marriage, she committed suicide at age 32. Her ex-husband found her hanging from a beam in her family beach house. She left the property to the people of St. John for a public park and recreation area. The original house was built too close to the coast and succumbed to a hurricane. Today, the Virgin Islands government maintains a community center in the area. Thank you very much. This has been Barbie. I hope you learned something today. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Share this with your friends if you liked it. Have a great day.